G'day, g'day. Before Horizon and before Killzone, there was Shellshock NAM 67. Yeah, I wasn't even aware of that until I looked up who developed it for this video. As you'll see though, it's not exactly a hidden gem or misunderstood classic, so it is really interesting to know how much better Guerrilla's games would be following this one. I enjoyed it on PS2 back in the day, and I'm fully understanding of the fact that I've really been spoiled by so many terrific games over the years, so that might kind of skew my opinion on some older games when I go back and revisit them. But when I say this game is rough to play, I don't mean it's rough when compared to the perfection that is Doom Eternal. I mean it's just genuinely rough. Aiming seems to have some sort of weird acceleration thing going on, where your camera movements are slow at first, and then it speeds up, almost like the DPI levels are switching between 800 and 3000. Trying to line up enemies becomes rough for this very reason, and sniping becomes much slower than it should be. For added insult, weapons have a bloom to their recoil pattern that is just slightly worse than Battlefield 2042's. When crouched and waiting for the reticule to tighten up for more accurate shots, you will still very likely miss your targets. Going prone helps, but your character will move every time you move the camera a little bit too far, so essentially you've got to hit prone and just look at the one spot or keep your aim to a very tight cone. Hopefully the gameplay can properly convey these things that I'm talking about. Rest assured though, it plays much worse than it looks. Controls were a little unorthodox, but easy to get used to. You use your interact button, but you must use the mouse left click to actually select the highlighted action. If you want to cycle through multiple actions, you keep hitting E. People who have played Armor might be familiar with such a requirement. Grenades are on F and must be individually equipped and thrown, but you can toggle to either explode on a timer or on impact. Depending on the distance you try to throw them, you might end up aiming the camera so far up that you can't actually see the intended trajectory of the grenade and just have to hope for the best. That's kind of a frustrating aspect of it. The only other weird thing, or maybe different would be a better word, is that sprinting is done with the spacebar, but again, perfectly functional. Missions require you to mow down Viet Cong and just get to certain destinations or do things like blowing up supplies and such. In between, you can wander the main base, talk to other characters, buy lewd postcards using your currency, and take part in some boom boom. When I hear boom boom, I can only think of Adventure Time.
This baby just needs some love and kisses to be happy. Mwah, mwah, mwah. There, see? Now it's happy.
You just kissed a boom boom baby, so don't expect any more sugar from me, sweetheart, until we wash your dirty, dirty face.
The game tries to do something different within its campaign with one particular mission that you can stealth through. It's optional, but the stealth doesn't really make any sense. Enemies will hear you unless you're crawling around in the prone position, and to be honest, I didn't want to spend my time leopard crawling through a whole mission. Other than stealth, there's also a couple of turret sections. Using them is great because the bloom for weapons doesn't seem to impact the turrets as much, so you can just full send at a group of enemies. Difficulty wise, I felt as though the terrible aiming made the game harder. There are a few sections where enemies really start to overwhelm you though, and positioning actually becomes quite important. You'll also sometimes find some traps scattered around, but their occurrence aren't very frequent, and the visual clues they use to warn about them though are very obvious and easy to spot. The only time I came close to dying to a trap was when I started the game and hadn't been shown how to defuse them correctly, so I just stared at whatever the fuck this was and somehow tanked the explosion. On the hardest difficulty, mind you, so go me. What you're supposed to do is use the arrow keys to navigate from one end to the other. The last couple of things I want to mention gameplay wise is that enemies mostly use the same weapons and occasionally throw grenades. Some enemies will charge at you with machetes, but otherwise the only time you'll encounter a different enemy type is the final boss, who is a bit of a bullet sponge for some reason. It's very strange given that no other enemies are presented as a boss fight, but the AI isn't very good in general, so he's easy enough to get away from and doesn't push you much. And finally is the gore. I sort of remembered being able to blow off the legs and arms of enemies, but With explosives, you can turn them into a pile of flesh, and it's pretty brutal to look at, even for PS2 standards. Sometimes if you hit the enemy in the leg or the stomach, they'll actually have a separate animation that plays where they either go limp or collapse to the ground as they bleed out. And, faithful to real-life America, you can shoot innocents and get away with it. Graphics, keeping in mind this was a PS2 era game, are okay. I didn't have much trouble with seeing anything or making out details, but I think playing at 1440p helped with that. I've seen much worse on the PS2, but this also released on PC, and there were definitely much better looking games back in 04 on PC. Draw distance isn't too bad either. I don't really have much else to say. I think the footage should tell you all there is to know. Sound is going to be another short one. It's not great. Everything is kind of just serviceable and sounds like stock noises for the most part. Voice acting I was surprised by. It reminds me a lot of older war movies, which I have to assume are big inspirations for the game, and you can never go wrong with some Steve Blum. I didn't feel like any one character was outstanding. You're not going to find any performances that come close to matching Christopher Judge as Kratos or Melisanthe Mahout as Cassandra. I hope I said that name right. But at its worst, the acting is serviceable, and I think that's perfectly fine. Story-wise, you're a fresh recruit on your first tour of Vietnam. The pre-rendered cutscenes have this filter that makes the environment always look much darker, more gloomy, and they also use a film grain effect which looks okay, makes it look different, and shows the devs were really trying to do something creative with the game. Mission briefings are given with the in-game engine. A couple of missions in, your character is set up to become part of a special ops team, and they set up the big baddie that you have to hunt down. The way they portray General Diem almost makes the game seem like it's trying to emulate the mystery and horror of Apocalypse Now. You definitely get some horrific looking scenes of decapitated and rotten heads and such, but these are only minor glimpses into a harsher story at best. The game never fully commits to this tone or subject material. When you finally confront DM, as I mentioned in the gameplay section, it's just plain goofy, really. You've been hunting this mysterious and violent leader the whole game. You work your way through an onslaught of enemies with two barely capable soldiers by your side. I say barely capable because the AI for them sucks. And when you finally come face to face with DM, it's just a silly little battle where his AI fails to chase you correctly and your AI refuses to help storm the temple. So you just have to bait him out and kill him from the outside. Some missions you get other very small glimpses of more heavy topics, like watching the character Psycho just outright murder someone, a Viet Cong soldier committing suicide in absolute defiance to the Americans, and in some of the Viet Cong cave systems you'll find plenty of people that have been tortured to death. There's no dwelling on these scenes though, or any consequences either, other than sweet karma blowing an RPG into Psycho's gut. And the story isn't overly present either. You're told to go destroy some supplies or help some villagers, and small mentions of DM come up before the prostitute leader that has been leaking info to the Viet Cong coughs up the location. You kill him, defend the main base from a huge Viet Cong attack, get the nurses out of there, and survive an airstrike along with another character. On this last mission, I just want to mention that you and your mate are on board a heli that's taking you away for leave and respite before being shot out of the air by the attacking Viet Cong I mentioned. But you wake up in the cave untouched and completely free to move around for some reason, whilst your mate has been tied up and tortured. It's a strange series of events. But with that, we're done with Shellshock NAM 67. The game got a sequel called Blood Trails, which featured zombies of all things, and was apparently pretty crap. I recommend watching this video by Jarek the Gaming Dragon to learn more about it. He makes great videos covering all sorts of games, whether they're bad or good. By memory, I think every game he's done a video on is from the FPS genre as well, so if that's your cup of tea, he'll probably be a YouTuber that you enjoy. I was thinking of covering Conflict Vietnam next, seeing as I was already on the topic of the Vietnam War, and stumbled across the Viet Cong games, which I've never heard of before. I won't be able to play those two specifically because they're abandonware now, and through other means of acquiring them, I wasn't able to actually boot the games. Yet another reason we need better preservation of games. Until the next video, have a good one.